morning, everyone. It's really great to be here. You know, when we started the company 8 years ago, no code was not a thing at all. And now today, there is such an engagement behind where no code is today that this conference is a perfect example of how important no code has become. I still think we have a lot of potential, but we've come a very long way. So I guess when we start thinking about how does no code change the way we work and live, even more important before we get into this is ask ourselves, why is no code important? Why do we need to create new technologies like this? And to me, it comes down really to the fact that we can't live in a world where the power to create is kept by a few people only. Those few people being the ones that were lucky enough to be exposed very early on as a young age because of family background or the circumstances to code. The reason why we can do this is because that moves us into a world where only a few tens of thousands of people are the one creating the tools that everybody uses. And the problem is, if you only have a small part of the population that builds the tools that everybody uses, they will fix those problems with their own views and their own experiences. And if you look at what's going on currently in the world, the way some tech companies are being criticized for having made some design decisions that don't apply to everybody else, this is fundamentally the reason why we need to extend the power to create to other people. There are other ways you can see how big of a problem it is that we have this power to create in the hand of only a happy few. Look at the startups today that are being funded by venture capitalists. These startups are usually, whether it's food delivery startups or I'm talking about the consumer startups or ride-sharing startups that mostly end up trying to sell a product to people that already have a fairly easy life. They're the one, that have a high disposable income. And why is that? Is because since you have only such a little part of the population that can create things, it is very expensive to create software. And therefore, only opportunities that have a very big market opportunity can be using can raise money to use engineers to create things. And so instead of this status quo, we felt about 8 years ago when we started Bubble, and I think everyone in this no-code movement is in line with this, that it is just important to create a world where more people can create things so that software can be used in more places to improve the living situations or to solve problems at a more local level. So how do we do this? A lot of the people so far used to think that it was possible to do this by teaching people how to code. If you remember back in 2010, I think it was the beginning of the coding bootcamp frenzy, where everyone, from companies, governments, schools, were all trying to put their students to code, or their children to code, thinking that would be the solution for everything. And what we realized after a few years is that it's actually not working that way. Like in many ways, it's impossible to expect someone after a few weeks of a coding bootcamp to be able to run something in production. And so what that led us in 2012 was this observation and thinking there has to be a better way to solve that. There has to be a better way for people to be able to create things without writing code, to create things online. And so we felt, let's just change the tools. Today, and because no code is a bigger thing, it seems obvious, but if you remember in 2012, the world was not thinking that at all. Again, what was cool at the time is the ability to write a few lines of code that would teach a computer to do things. What we felt is that this felt very against the flow of history because fundamentally the tools to program hadn't really evolved over the previous 30 years. If you think about the way people were programming computers in the early 90s or even 80s, in 2010, it was still, typing code on a black screen in a language that a computer would understand, but that would basically be non-understandable by a non-technical person. And so we were like, let's fix this by, I would say not necessarily a new idea, because if you think of it, that's the idea that people already had when they built Windows on top of MS-DOS, Macintosh, which is let's just build a graphic user interface. And so then it was a long journey of, just make sure the platform was, and other no-code tools had the same thing, just make sure we had enough features to cover most use cases. And today we're at the point where I think no-code hasn't proven it can reach a scale of like massive, having an entire Fortune 500 company running solely on no-code platforms. But we have proven that from a feature standpoint, there is not too much that no-code can do anymore. This is we're at the point now where sometimes you might have to find some workarounds, but fundamentally you could build any, in the case of Bubble, web application. For the tools, it's going to be different platforms without writing any code. So what does that look like in practice? For people that are not familiar with Bubble, it's actually not as revolutionary as you'd think in many ways. You start by designing your application from a visual perspective, the different elements you will need on the page, and then you will program it. And on that one, each platform has a little bit of a different approach, where in our case, it's going to be, you define workflows saying when the user clicks here, you're going to do this, do this, do that. And to us, that's fundamentally what programming is about. Programming is not about writing code. Writing code is only the medium. Programming is about defining, thinking carefully about what you want your application to do, and telling in some way or another the computer what should happen in each case. So getting into the main theme of what I wanted to talk here, I would like to share a few stories of how people, how no-code, and from my vantage point, it's mostly Bubble, has changed some people, companies, or even life, and sometimes in a very personal way. And I'll get to this in a second. The first use case we're seeing, which was really the true goal that we set for ourselves in 2012 when we started, we wanted to empower people to start companies. We felt like, back to this food delivery example that I was giving you, we felt that it was a shame that only a few startups were lucky enough to get funded and would basically start solving problems for one specific need. And we're in New York seeing that so many domain experts, that's how we call them here, are capable of thinking of a new product to solve a problem, but they just didn't have the resources to solve it. And so that's what we started the company with, the mission, let's empower these people to start companies. And today we've seen thousands of people literally without a single hour of engineering training being able to get a product off the ground and run it. To give you an example, I think Nate will be speaking a little bit later. Nate, without being technical, was able to build a mobile app that helps people pay their student loans by rounding up the charges they get on their credit card. This sounds like a highly technical solution that can be built with no code. Another, still in the financial service, in that case, it was different. It was more of a larger team, a team that actually had a pretty big vision around, enabling people to have solar panels on their roof. They had no access to engineering talent, were able to find money from the financial world, but couldn't get their product off the ground. And in 2014, started building on top of us, to the point today where 6 years later, they've processed over $1 billion of loans through their platform. So they've given away, not for free, obviously, more than $1 billion of loans through a Bubble-built software. So we started with that vision. What we saw over the years, though, is new use cases that happened that became more intimate for people. We started seeing recently more and more smaller companies start building their own tools instead of using something off the shelf to improve their business situations. So think of it as, instead of hiring a SaaS product to manage your HR, you start building your internal systems because for some reasons it fits better your goals. And I think this is something really important that no-code offers, which is a power of customization. At the end of the day, each business has different challenges and different circumstances. And very often the product you're going to find off the shelf on the market are not going to be good enough and suitable enough for what you're trying to do. So what we saw, for instance, in Canada is a company started building their entire internal business tool suite, from HR to inventory management and to invoicing, all on Bubble. You could argue, why not using a product off the shelf? Well, they looked into it and they realized to be more efficient, they needed to build something for their own. And what we see at the company level, when some people do this inside a company, we've also seen people doing that in their own life. And that's where I think no-code is starting to be the most exciting, when we start getting into how people manage their lives. So I know some people who have built their personal to-do or thought tracker on Bubble. We've seen a a Harvard professor built his own office hour booking tool because he was not satisfied with the one on Bubble, because he was not satisfied with the way with the tool that Harvard was providing him with. And in some ways, this is really getting the power to create to people in a sense where, oh, I have this step in my life that is a little bit tedious. Why don't I just invest a couple of hours on Bubble or on another no-code tool to make it more pleasant for me? That is truly the essence of the meaning of what we're trying to do here, which is give the power to create to everyone. The last example I would give is, in some ways, I think the most representative of what you can do with Bubble in a highly unexpected circumstance. So I was in Berlin 2 years ago at a meetup meeting some users. And then someone comes to me at the end after my presentation and says, I want to thank you for creating Bubble because Bubble saved my relationship. And I was like, oh, okay, I've never used that before. Where are you going with this? And then he explains to me that he had a tradition with his girlfriend at the time, I hope they're still together today, where they would give each other an advent calendar, the little calendar on December 1st, where you have 1 day behind each month till Christmas. And 1 year, the previous year, he had forgotten to buy one, and it was November 30th. And he ended building on Bubble, like a digital one that his girlfriend could be using with her iPad. And so every day she would be clicking on the day and a little surprise would show up. And he was adding surprises on a daily basis to make sure to keep up with the progress of the month. This sounds like a very small thing, but in many ways, the fact that, when he's having like a relationship challenge and be like, oh shit, I need to really fix that. The fact that this person realize that, well, I can just create something online that will make her happy. And it's not going to take me years of training. I'll do that in a few minutes, is truly what no-code is about. No-code is about, removing the distinction between creator of technology and users and just empower everyone to, whether it's for business or for personal reasons, can just, suddenly be like, oh yeah, I can do this. All right, let's get started. And an hour later, get a product. I have to say, this story, of all the success stories we've seen over the years, is probably the one that touched me the most, because it was really using no-code technologies in a context that I had never thought about, with the goal that I couldn't possibly imagine we would ever have an impact on. And that was honestly the most heartwarming thank you that I had from a user ever. That said, thank you very much for having me, and I would love to take a couple of questions. This is, the world we live in with COVID now, where, online conferences happen that way. To give a little bit more, a few more examples of what people build with us. People starting companies on Bubble is very much, the bread and butter of what we're doing today. And a lot of people sometimes ask, why do you choose that strategy versus, for instance, going to enterprise or large companies? And our view is pretty simple on this. And people, in particular investors, would sometimes challenge this approach, saying, startups, it's cool, but they're going to fail. And it's true, like startups do fail often. On the flip side, though, startups are really, the most vivid, responsive, reactive entities in the business world. And so when you work on the new technologies that is expected to evolve quickly, especially early on in its development, this is a very important thing to be working with people who have a similar development cycle. Going with enterprise, for instance, with a much slower life cycle, would slow down our development just because you have to match what your users are expecting. And the great thing with startups is, even though a lot of them, sometimes don't work out, the skill that, the founders or the entrepreneur are building on top of Bubble, just learning how to use the tool, is something that can be reused anywhere in the world. And so today we're still very much investing on this. We've seen companies, raise, multi-million-dollar rounds, going to Y Combinator. And again, always people who never thought they would be able to create some things prior to building it on Bubble, because they were not able to find engineers. If you think of Y Combinator, for instance, which is still today the most famous accelerator, Paul Graham used to say that what makes the value of an engineer, of a team, a founding team, is the number of technical people on the team. Like, he was like, at the end of the day, non-technical people are not going to be able to contribute at first. Well, today, Y Combinator takes Bubble startups. And this shows how much not only technologies have matured, but also how the whole ecosystem has realized that just thinking that being technical means writing code is an outdated way to see things. Today, being technical means being able to build something online, whatever the tools are, and no-code platforms have proven to be very much capable of doing that. There is, at some point, our goal with Bubble is to get to the entire development world. My goal personally, the mission I set for myself when we started this company 8 years ago, is that at some point, anyone building something online should go to Bubble first before asking himself whether the platform needs to be extended with code. And so another way is, if you stop someone in the street and ask them, hey, do you know how can I build this? I want Bubble to be the first reaction they have. To get there, we'll start expanding to other target groups, particular education. We're currently doing a very big push on colleges because we think using Bubble to teach computing thinking is something very valuable, but eventually in enterprise. But again, starting with startups because they are the growing entities of the business world. And personally, watching people create businesses from nothing, starting on the platform, on Bubble, is something that is particularly exciting.
Emmanuel, there were a lot of great questions while you were sharing your thoughts, and thank you very much. It's always inspiring and practical because it's always great to hear about new ideas, but it's even better to hear that those ideas are actually already happening. They're happening every day, done by people just like you and me. And that's exactly the thing that makes that whole thing work. One question that I think was the best from the one that were asked is about the level of abstraction, let's say so, because your position, which I fully share, by the way, is that the no-code is a natural evolution of technology, of programming, and it didn't happen overnight. It was a long process that eventually got us where we are right now.
Yep.
To which extent do you think there is going to be like an evolution in that regard? Will there be ever a point where the developer, the maker, the builder, whenever you name it, is no longer going to be classified by whether he's coding or no coding, whether there's going to be some sort of a unified set of tools? Maybe it's not one tool, maybe one. I hope that your vision about Bubble is exactly correct. But will there ever be a point where there's going to be no need for separation between code and no-code tools? What do you think?
I might have a not a pleasant response because I do think there will still be a difference, and I think it's totally fine. I think what the world has forgotten is that being a coder is a specialist job, and that job will remain. What is changing is how often you need code to do things, and so the bigger the no-code platforms get, the less you need code. So effectively, I don't think, and that's why sometimes I prefer, visual programming to no code as a denomination, because we're not trying to oppose code here. We're just trying to expand how much you can do without code. Some of the coders that use code today will migrate to using platforms like Bubble. And then you will still have some specialists in the world, like coders, that would build, in the context of Bubble, for instance, that would be plugins, but extend the platform with code. And so what we're trying to become as a platform is a place where both kind of people can collaborate, like create, a common language between the non-technical, non-coder and the coder. But it's still going to be two different jobs, which I think is actually for the best. Because if you think of it, the shortage of engineering today is a major issue. That's what I was talking a little bit earlier today. It blocks so much development of ideas. And so if we create a platform where you still have coders that expand a platform like Bubble, the leverage is much higher because once one coder has built a thing, it can be built by a ton of non-coders. But I still think the jobs would be different, though.
For sure, yeah, definitely. Thank you. That was an amazing response. One last one from me, and it's again on the same topic because it's both good and bad when people are kind of putting code versus no code, and it gives a lot of traction to those conversations and raises a lot of curiosity and questions. But on the other hand, it creates unnecessary hostility between people who are coding and people who are aspiring or practicing no-coders. What do you think about this question? Because eventually this is kind of working for no-code because people talk more about this, but I think there's a lot of unnecessary arguments around whether one or the other is better or worse. And so where do you think this is going to stop?
It will stop when no-code platforms will become good enough that it ends the argument. Like it's normal. Whenever you have a new way to do things, some people that are already very effective and proficient with the old way will see the limitations first. And in some ways, it's a very healthy pressure. Like when engineers start using Bubble, when we started, we really wanted we didn't try to get a single engineer on the platform. And I think the first 4 or 5 years were all non-technical people. Today, it's a little bit different. Like today, we probably have 10, 15% of our user base who has some kind of code knowledge. And so having sometimes some pressure coming from them, whether, hey, how about you improve this that way so that, it's more performant, it's actually a healthy pressure. The one thing I will say, but as soon as we solve these things, then, there will be no ground for complaint, right? And, people will just embrace no-code technology. What I want to tell, though, to the coders, and I'm one of them initially, I've written a lot of code myself, is no code is your best friend, because no code is actually the technology that will enable you not to be bugged by people all the time to build things that are actually not that interesting to build. At the end of the day, a marketplace, whether you sell, cars, apartments, it's a marketplace. And when you ask an engineer to build that, sure, you can make a good living building them, but it's not that interesting, right? So instead, no code will free you time so that you can focus on the most interesting problems to solve. And if I may, back to the theme of this speech that I just did on how it will change your life, in many ways, the way no code can change our life the most is by freeing time of smart coders that can write code to solve problems, and they're going to start solving things that I have no idea of. I don't know, whether it's going to be in the healthcare space, environmental problems. Like there are a ton of places where writing code would be extremely valuable. And today, these engineers are being sucked in, working like, again, the food delivery startups that probably create some value in the world, but not technically, right? So let's free these talents and have them work on true hard problems, which I think would be better for everyone, especially coders.
Perfect. Thank you, Emmanuel. That is the ideal way to sum up your thoughts on this, exactly my thoughts on this. Thank you. Bubble is a very special company for Zeroqode. This is the company that has started our no-code journey. So thank you very much for sharing your valuable insight and advice. Emmanuel, it's always great to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. That was very fun.
Thank you.